So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Whitney Broadaway. I'm the collections manager at the Orange County Regional History Center. This is one of our lunch and learn events on the first Friday of every month. And today we're going to be talking about collecting and preserving for the Black Lives Matter movement. And we have some experts with us. So thankfully, I won't be doing much of the talking. We are going to be talking to some other people from around the country. Unfortunately, our friend from the George Floyd Memorial, Janelle Austin, was not able to join us. So I might say a few things just about what's going on with the George Floyd Memorial at the end of the program, but we will just give our other panelists a little bit more time. So I'll go ahead and start with letting our panelists introduce themselves. We'll just kind of go in order for how we're going to speak. So Pasha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. My name is Pasha Baker. I am the director and CEO of the Goldsboro Westside Community Historical Association Incorporated, a very long name. And I am a third generation member and resident, lifelong resident here of Goldsboro, Florida. The Goldsboro is your second Black incorporated U.S. city in these United States. The first one, of course, is down the road here in Central Florida. It's called Eatonville. They were both founded by two brothers. Joseph Clark founded Eatonville. A few years later, his brother, William Clark, founded Goldsboro. So we are happy to join you. And I represent the Trayvon Martin Memorial. About that brief history, Trayvon Martin happened here in Sanford, Florida, some time ago, about 2012, I believe. And it started and was the site of the Black Lives Matter movement that we know today as well. And it kicked off a storm of marches and protests, speakings, and policy changes as well here in the city of Sanford and all around the nation and the world. It took notice. So we have about 600 to 700 pieces collected from that time period. And you saw them recently. They were used in the Jay-Z documentary of Trayvon Martin that was on the Paramount Network. And so we still have those archived pieces, as well as we lent some to our friends at the Orlando Regional History Center as well for their Ocoee Massacre, to show the transitions and the different time periods that definitely happened. Because as we know, and the reason why we are the legacy keepers and the history keepers, as I like to say, is because we know that history has been repeating itself. And so we can show those time periods from the Ocoee Massacre to Trayvon Martin, to our friends there in South Carolina, to everything that has happened. One of my things we recently had last year was our Geechee Gullah exhibition. So something that I'm very, very interested in. So I will pass it along to my legacy keeper over in South Carolina, Miss Brenda.
Thank you, Pasha, for that very thoughtful introduction to yourself and the work that you're doing there. Again, my name is Brenda Tyndall. I am the Director of Education and Engagement at the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, which is slated to open in 2022. I'm here, though, to talk a bit about an exhibit that I co-curated in response to the officer-involved shooting that took place in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2016, which subsequently led to the creation of the No Justice, No Peace exhibition and a suite of programming to help build understanding across the Charlotte region, and frankly has become a model for rapid response exhibitions for the museum field. It's interesting that we're having this conversation today, in part because I believe today is Trayvon Martin's birthday.
You got it.
And so to have this conversation in alignment with his birthday, I think is very meaningful. And I'm just really I really appreciate the platform to really talk about the important work happening within museums and heritage cultural sites as it relates to contemporary social justice movements. So delighted to be part of this conversation.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Before we move on, I just want to make a couple of announcements that if anyone has any questions during the program, this is a webinar Zoom format, not like a Zoom meeting. So that's why if you're attending, your video and your sound is not working. It's just the panelists. But please feel free to use our chat and type in questions. I will be watching the chat and feeding our panelists questions either throughout their talk or at the end. And so if your video is not working, it's not a mistake. And Pasha, I'd like to start with you. I know you did already give a brief history of Goldsboro, and but if you wanted to say anything more about the history of Goldsboro, and then talk a little bit about 2012 when Trayvon Martin was shot.
Definitely. So the history of Goldsboro, like I said, is first of two Black incorporated cities here in the United States, located in Central Florida. One thing that people may not realize, even though we are, most people recognize Disney World and Florida not really being the South. However, at one point in time, it had more lynchings than everybody else in the South. And it has a long racial history. And we have a history that has never ended. We are still making history, as we saw with the Capitol protest January 6th. We still have racial undertones that are still happening here. So those first two Black incorporated cities, the first one in 1877 was Eatonville. We were emancipated, enslavement ended in 1865. So you have two Black men that are brothers that founded and incorporated all Black townships. The same way you ran a city yesterday is the same way you run a city today. You had your mayor, you had your alderman, you had your Black Chamber of Commerce, you had your businesses, you had the way you paid taxes by two Black men that shortly after enslavement ended. And during enslavement, we weren't allowed to read and write. So instead of just living off the land, they incorporated their own cities. Shortly after, 20 years after the beginning of Goldsboro, when the land was chartered, the charter was stolen by the city of Sanford. And it neglected this Black city that it had stolen the charter from. And of course, just like today, there's only so much land in the world. And so the charter was stolen. Of course, the citizens fought back. And then you have that leading up to where you never trusted the government, where you never trusted, because people still remember this happened in 1920. So either you were passed down to it. Like I said, I'm 3 generations here. As most people, there are a couple of generations here in the South, if they never moved. So you were passed down to it, and you knew the history. You knew that your city was stolen to make something else larger, and that city always neglected you. And so there were always underlying racial tensions in the city of Sanford and throughout Seminole County, because we know that things were never equal. Our communities didn't look like other communities in the city. So when Trayvon Martin happened, those racial tensions came to surface here in the city of Sanford. And so we knew that because Trayvon Martin, unfortunately, wasn't the first person to die in that manner in the city of Sanford. So all of that came to surface as well. And now we're taking baby steps to bridge those gaps. And one of the ways that we bridge the gaps is through platforms like this, by telling the history and by having different productions, and always remembering that history can and will repeat itself if you don't know it.
So from a museum perspective, because at 2012 you were at the Goldsboro Museum, right?
That's right.
You're the director now. Were you the director in 2012?
No, that was my Aunt Frances Oliver. She was the director. And that's one of the things, that's how we got all of these buildings. As I told you before, I was walking across the street to another building because the other building is actually, I rent that building from the city of Sanford. And during that time, they did not want any type of press or recollection to Trayvon Martin. They didn't want to have anything to do with that on city and state property because of all the heat that was coming down, not only from the state level, but across the world. You know, this was a global effect.
Yeah,
that's right. And that really put the city of Sanford, something that people would only say, oh, okay, it's outside of, on the outskirts of Orlando. It really made Sanford a well-known name. And that's why we do own the building across the street, so that we could house those collections, so we could tell people the accurate history.
I had no idea that you basically had to own your own building so that it wouldn't be a city building.
That's right. That's right. And that was the mention of my aunt. You know, the city said, okay, well, you can't have anything related to Trayvon Martin in this building. No, you can't talk about it. You can't do anything because this is city-owned property. She said, okay, I'll buy the building across the street. And that's what we did.
That's fascinating. This is exactly.
And you met Francis, you all know.
This is exactly the type of thing that I want to get into about, you know, these are a lot of things that I don't think people realize when watching the Black Lives Movement. You know, from a spectator point of view, you can see a lot of what's happening with the protests and the marches, but I love getting into what is happening behind the scenes in the museums that are trying to preserve what's going on.
We had to fight to preserve it.
So how soon were you guys able to purchase a completely new building?
Well, thank you to the owner of the building. Pretty quickly, we were able to move in right away. We fixed the building up and then started to have people that would bring us things. And now, because when Trayvon Martin, where the area was murdered, remember there was a big deal made about that he was murdered outside of a gated community. And that community where he was murdered, people started bringing all types of different types of memorials there. The community, nor did the city of Sanford want that memorial there. So the community here in Goldsboro, that's why the memorial, and I can take you outside. We have the little ring light thing here. I can take you outside, and that's why we have the memorial here in Goldsboro. He didn't die. He wasn't murdered in Goldsboro. It's because that community did not want that to be a symbolic gesture of what had happened. Every time they go in and outside their gates, and every time someone's looking to purchase a home, that would have been a memorial of what happened there.
Exactly.
And so you have these things, just like I'm sure in South Carolina, what happened there is different than where we have the background scenes of how we get to collect this information. That's why we had to get another building to collect and preserve the history, because they didn't want, at the time, no, they didn't want anything to do with it.
So for our attendees who might not know, it was actually in 2013 when George Zimmerman was acquitted that the hashtag Black Lives Matter started really trending on Facebook and Twitter and became a thing. Obviously, we're talking about this has always been an issue, but the name Black Lives Matter was assigned to it really because of Trayvon Martin, which is one of the reasons we're having this program, because as Central Floridians, this is a huge part of our history and our culture, that this movement was spurned out of our area.
You got it. And when we could talk about Black Lives Matter movement, when we talk about George Floyd, when we talk about what happened in South Carolina, when we talk about what happened in St. Louis with Michael Brown, when we talk about what happened in New York, and that wasn't the first time we heard I Can't Breathe with Eric Garner. When we talk about these things, we have a long history, because I can just point right over here, and I'll grab him really fast, but we're still asking, why wasn't Emmett Till's murderer captured? He was a young boy.
Mhm.
And so when we talk about history repeating itself, you look at the manners that both of these young men were murdered in.
Mhm.
And that's where we say we need to preserve so it won't happen again.
Exactly. So when did you notice, I'm curious if you noticed a change there in Goldsboro and Sanford when this moved well, first of all, what was the community like? What was the feeling in the air? What was the museum dealing with while the trial went on? Because that was a rough trial experience.
That was. We were dealing the same type of things that we deal with now. A lot of people asking questions. And a lot of people wanted to know the history of Sanford, because a lot of people would think, oh, okay, it's just this evil, racist place. And really, it was an undertone of everything that's happening, or a microcosm of everything that's happening in our culture today. There's still underlying racial issues that have never been brought to the forefront. That's why museums and platforms like this are so important, because the history has to be told accurately. And in a lot of our history books, they aren't told accurately. And that's the side of the museum. The museum has its own voice. And so we wanted to make sure we can tell that story accurately without any judgment or fear from any area. So that's why we bought the building. Because we're able to tell that story. No, he wasn't shot. He was murdered. This is what happened. And this is where it happened. These are the things that took place. There was a city that was taken from all of the Blacks that were here in Goldsboro. And then there were different racial tensions with the other Black neighborhoods about being untreated fairly, about not having sidewalks, about environmental injustice, about criminal justice and harassment or what have you from different entities. So there was still this tension that led up to this. And so we want to make sure it's told accurately so that we can prevent it from happening again.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think that's a huge part of basically the role that museums have to encompass and, take up that banner and move forward with it. Mm-hmm. When the Black Lives Matter hashtag started trending and started building up a real presence across, the United States, did that start to affect you guys at Goldsboro? Did you see any changes in, say, what the museum was collecting, things showing up out of the memorial that you all had created?
So what we did, so the city of Sanford called my aunt, who's played a role in civil history for a long time. She's always got on her marching boots, still marching this weekend for something that happened at an incident in Kissimmee in Osceola. So what the city of Sanford did, they called my aunt and they said, would you take the memorial? Can you house it there in Goldsboro? She said yes. And at every rally, remember, there were rallies that outnumbered the people that actually lived in Sanford. One of the largest rallies was 55,000+, and there were at the time, there were about 30 to 40,000 people that actually lived in Sanford. So all of those type of memories, we have people that signed, we have the banners from the marches, we have people that left all of those mementos at the memorial site, that we have here. A lot of Skittles and a lot of tea and those type of memorabilia. Medallions, you'll see people with praying hands and those type of things as well, and mementos. So they would leave that, and we began to collect and archive it, because we know that this was a moment when it started going global and when it started capturing headlines, and you saw people with hoodies on the front of every Black magazine cover in the world.
When the city basically reached out to your aunt and said that they don't want the memorial. They wanted her to take over the memorial.
They asked, can you take the memorial? Yeah.
Did that involve, did you all actually have to go into where they were, where the memorial was already organically growing? Did you have to physically move the memorial, or was it more of a
The city actually brought it to us, and they began delivering it because it was a lot of materials. So they had already began, because otherwise it would just pile over and take up almost the whole street. Remember, there's a school right across the street. It's out there where he was murdered at, is actually right behind the mall. So a high traffic zone is actually right behind the Kohl's. High traffic zone, a lot of people, a lot of communities along the street. Like I said, a school across the street. So they had began collecting it, and they kept bringing it over each and every day, collecting pieces. And then at each march or visual, anything that happened, we also collected that as well and preserved that.
So I want to move over to Brenda, but Pasha, please be thinking about if you want to add more things, because I think we'll have some extra time to keep talking. Brenda, would you please tell us about, first of all, what you were doing at you were at the Levine Museum of the New South my notes, in 2016, when Keith Scott was shot. Would you please walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a PowerPoint that I'd like to share as part of my presentation.
Yes, and then perhaps after your PowerPoint, Pasha, I would love to take you up on taking a look at Trayvon's memorial, because it is lovely.
Definitely, we're ready for you. We got the ring light here.
You don't have to walk yet, but I'm just prepping you.
And so thank you, Whitney, for the invitation to talk a bit about the No Justice, No Peace exhibition. And quite frankly, when I think about that moment in Charlotte, North Carolina, I certainly understand it to be a reckoning, a racial reckoning, but a community reckoning, to say the least. And so I've entitled my presentation, Reckoning and the Making of a Rapid Response Exhibit in the New South. And to your point, Whitney, this exhibition, the No Justice, No Peace exhibit, and frankly, the reckoning that I refer to was in response to what happened in Charlotte in September 2016 with the officer involved shooting of Keith Lamont Scott. And to be clear, what made his the shooting of Keith Lamont Scott, and frankly, the murder of Keith Lamont Scott, so problematic was because it happened on the heels of several other officer-involved shootings that high profile that had happened throughout the country. For instance, Philando Castile had occurred. His shooting in Minneapolis had occurred in July of 2016, and that was followed by Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So you had a number of high profile cases of officer involved shootings. And then from a local perspective, the Keith Lamont Scott shooting certainly only inflamed an already troubling reality regarding the relationship between African American communities and their relationship with law enforcement. One of the questions that was leveraged during Pasha's presentation was about all of the questions that her community was asking. And Charlotte is no different. As the staff historian and senior vice president of research and collections at Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, one of the questions I consistently heard was, how could this happen in Charlotte? How could Charlotte become ground zero for protest, for a violent officer-involved shooting? And my response to that was, why not Charlotte? And part of the why not had so much to do with the longer history that none of this happened in a vacuum. In other words, if we understand the history of a place like Charlotte and many other New South cities, then we know that none of us are immune from these kinds of episodes of unrest. And so this was actually one of the photographs taken by one of our partners, our community partners, Alvin C. Jacobs, who is an image activist, and I'll get to him in just a second. But as the staff historian, I kept hearing, how could this happen in Charlotte? How could this happen in Charlotte? And it was a clarion call in many ways to begin to respond. And part of that clarion call included a suite of approaches. Charlotte, the Levine Museum of the New South really had and continues to have an important reputation as a place where community members can come to understand. And as a result of that, it was not surprising that the next question that followed, how could this happen in Charlotte, was what is Levine Museum going to do? One, we were located, or the museum is located in downtown Charlotte, which is where much of the unrest took place. And we you know, we engaged in a number of strategies for engaging with community members. We made sure that there was a virtual component. I mean, this totally predates all of the virtual programming that we're doing now as a result of COVID-19. But we hosted a tweet chat that really was inspired by not simply what happened in Charlotte, but again, what was happening throughout the nation. We also know, I should note, that much of the work that we were doing related to episodes like this were also inspired by what was happening in the field. By the time that we get to 2016, the museum field also was engaged in the museums and Ferguson. There was also the Museums and Race Initiative, which I was one of the founding members of, as well as the Museums as Sites of Social Action, which started in Minneapolis. And so there was a great deal of movement happening within the museum field in response to such community crises and unrest. In addition to our sort of virtual efforts, we hosted a town hall, and the picture that you see here is from that town hall. And I share this picture because I was worried that no one would show up. I was worried that folks were still scared. I mean, city of Charlotte had become an occupied city. And so downtown, which is normally bustling, or Center City as Charlotteans call it, is normally bustling with activity, had all of a sudden become a ghost town. So I was worried that no one would show up. Needless to say, there were over 100 plus people that showed up. It was standing room only. And what that demonstrated to me and to my colleagues at the Levine Museum of the New South is that appetite to have a conversation about the discourses taking place in our community, particularly as it related to African Americans in law enforcement. And so this town hall was an opportunity to begin to place this long history into deeper context. We also hosted a museum open house to invite people back to Center City, and we did some curated tours that focused particularly on law enforcement. It focused in particular on sort of the racial dimensions, if you will, of our exhibition, again, to provide that historical context, to help people start to begin to develop answers to that, why did this happen in Charlotte, right? And then, of course, our sort of anchor response was the No Justice, No Peace exhibition and community engagement initiative. And I'd like to talk a bit more about what our strategy was there. This was actually a rapid response exhibit. And what that means is that typically in a museum, we would have a calendar of installations or exhibitions that we curate and or work with other partners to curate and to install at our institution. In order to respond quickly, we probably cut at least 2.5 years off of that work and developed an exhibition and a suite of programs within a matter of 3 months. Don't do this at home. Let me just say this, that approach is not for the faint of heart. It takes a great deal of bandwidth on the part of a museum staff, but also because it was so important that this wasn't just the product of the museum, but that it was the product of the community. This was one of the most important exhibitions that we'd done to that point that I believe it's important to note that while I was the lead curator, I really situate myself as a co-curator because we co-curated this exhibition with community, and that was deeply important. We also established a number of strategic partnerships to again help deepen our articulation of the moment, to help us tell this story in a way that would be authentic and that would be informed by community members writ large. We hosted a number of targeted dialogues, and then we also developed multi and intergenerational public programming that would bring community members together across social and economic difference. As I mentioned, one of our most important strategies was our community and strategic partnerships. Two partners in particular, image activist Alvin C. Jacobs Jr. And Dr. Tiffany Packer, who was a history professor teaching a course related to another event that had happened, another officer involved shooting that had happened. She was already working on some materials with her public history students. And so we invited them to contribute, in the case of Mr. Jacobs, his corpus of images from community unrest related to officer involved shootings in places like Baltimore, in Chicago, in Asheville, North Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina. He had essentially developed this amazing corpus of images that captured the raw emotions of communities in distress following episodes of violence. And so we were able to incorporate his work into one of the galleries. And then, of course, the public history students at Johnson C. Smith contributed memorials, if you will, to individuals who had been victims of police-involved shootings. We also talk about collecting. One of the ways that we sought to rapidly respond and to also make sure that this was inherently a community-centric curation project was to call for contributions. And our call went out to a diversity of people. Our thought was that it was important that we included folks from all parts of the community, faith-based leaders, activists, police officers, artists, business folks, anyone who was impacted. And we began to receive quite a few ephemera, art, clothing that would help us tell this story in a way, again, that would be authentic. You'll see the boots, the tennis shoes are Braxton Winston, who was one of the very active protesters and activists in the city, who also eventually became a city councilman after this incident. And then the boots of Mike Capagna, who was one of the police officers who really had developed a rapport with community activists. And so we have his boots as a demonstration of this juxtaposition between people and police. But also as a way to help tell the story, a more nuanced story about the relationship that was being built in a place like Charlotte between protesters and police officers. We were able to repurpose boarding that was used for some of the downtown buildings that were damaged during the protests, and artists were asked to actually create pieces with the boarding. And so we were able to acquire a number of those pieces as part of our exhibition. And then we also have just a wide array of artists and talent in Charlotte that were able to contribute other footage, whether it be from camera footage and or photographs as part of that work. Perhaps one of the most important parts of the community co-curation part of it, and an extension of that call for contributions, was we were not only just collecting materials or ephemera, we also were collecting stories. And those stories were deeply important to helping to tell this diverse and complex story of the unrest and the events that led to that unrest in Charlotte. What you'll see here is we collected one of the book bags of a first responder. And I always like to read this particular quote because it just places so much into context. This is a quote from one of the medics, Julie Marie Forbes Anderson, and this was her backpack. And this is what she said, and it's just such a powerful excerpt from her contribution. She said, "The injury that stuck with me the most was to a girl of 16 who was hit with a tear gas canister. She was completely silent up until the moment she told me, quote, 'The police are supposed to protect you, and I'm pretty sure they would have been fine killing us. Is this what Black people go through every day?'" You know, and the goal was not to demonize police. Really, the goal was to bring to the fore the diversity of perspectives that shaped this discourse in Charlotte. And so we heard from policemen, we heard from first responders, we heard from business owners and activists, because we wanted to show a panoramic view of our community. Another image, as well as a shirt that was still active with tear gas when we collected it. We were all coughing because there was so much tear gas on this shirt when we initially acquired it. So it just speaks to the politics of collecting these kinds of materials from active protests. And in terms of community co-curation, this was another strategy that I think is deeply important. I call it sort of democratizing content development and delivery. And the point here is that museums have often been authoritative in the ways in which they tell the story of their community, or they curate shows. And we really thought that doing this show meant that we needed to be sure that we democratize that content development. And part of the ways that we did that was through hosting community listening sessions. We convened a number of tear-filled, intimate dialogues with community and museum stakeholders. And we also hosted a pre-opening exhibit community editing forum. So as we were developing panels, we let people come in with sticky notes and put their notes on it. What's missing? What impacted you in the text? What was triggering for you? So that as we work on the final show, we would have put in strategies that would, that would meet our community where they are. That it was in a language that our community could connect with, that the images and the voices and the perspectives that were offered were wide and varied. And so this, the editing forum was particularly productive at ensuring that we were capturing a diversity of perspective.
That editing forum is fascinating to me. I have a quick question before you move on. Was that completely open to the public, or did you have a select group of community members that came through? And how long was that editing forum open for? Was it a day, a week? I have more than one question, apparently.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. The editing forum was for a day, and I think we had it for roughly about 2 hours. But again, it was bookended by a number of conversations and meetings with community partners, with museum stakeholders, including our board, as well as members. But it was an open forum. We did do some targeted invites to folks whose perspective would aid in the sort of refining of the exhibition. But for the most part, it was an open invitation to our community.
Oh, I love that. Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Important to this, as a history museum, we always wanted to be sure that we that the exhibition experience was not shorn of sort of historical and scholarly expertise. And what was deeply important to me is that we talk about these contemporary issues within their historical context. And so we use 3 modules to really help contextualize why Charlotte had become this sort of hotbed of unrest. We talked about housing, we talked about schools, and we talked about criminal justice as our 3 modules. And what that did was just to underscore the fact that this can't be understood as happening in a vacuum, that there are social issues and dynamics that have created this kind of tension and this kind of unrest. And we need to understand what that history is. And so we really provided a timeline, really bookended between the 1960s or 1950s and the present. as our metric for providing context. The other thing is this exhibition was developed in tandem with the 2015 study done by scholars in California and at Harvard. It was the Chetty study, which ranked Charlotte as 50 of 50 in social and intergenerational poverty, which meant that if you were born into poverty, the chances of being to transcend poverty is nearly nil. And so it was important that we tapped into that discourse as well. And so these 3 modules really afforded us the opportunity to engage with existing discourses taking place within the city. And so this was just a way to, again, historically contextualize the events of 2016. And we called it Swan to Scott, basically from Swan v. Board of Education to the Keith Lamont Scott shooting. And Swan, as you know, was an important decision that would lend additional value to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, particularly with the implementation of busing. So Charlotte had this huge reputation as being a city, not quite like Atlanta that said it was too busy to hate, but certainly a very progressive identity. And so this really kind of disrupted our sensibilities of ourselves, I think.
Pasha, did you want to jump in with something?
Definitely. Awesome job, Brenda. And I'm enjoying your presentation. Quick question. The Levine Museum, the museum that represents this experience, is that a museum that is owned by the city of Charlotte? Where's the funding to, I mean, it's an amazing site. Where did the funding come from to do this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the museum itself has a number of funding streams, at least while I was there. I'm no longer on that team, so I can't speak to where their funding is coming from at the moment. But in terms of funding for this particular exhibition, again, we were able to get funding from a number of members of our community, including Charlotte is a big banking town. So Bank of America actually underwrote portions of the exhibition and also supported and underwrote portions of some of the programming that we created as part of this. So we did get funding from a number of institutions, both corporate and nonprofit.
Oh, awesome. So the city or county did not have anything to do with it?
No, I'll say that I wouldn't say they didn't have anything to do with it from a funding perspective. From an intellectual perspective and a content development perspective, I would say that the city absolutely had their input because we were using city resources in terms of documents.
Okay.
Of the perspectives that we gathered were coming from city officials, from law enforcement. So we used a wide range of resources that transcended financial contribution. And again, I'm just showing you just a few scenes from the exhibition. This was actually an audiovisual protest tunnel where you could actually see the images that we crowdsourced and enlarged, but you could also hear live footage. So that as you're walking down this tunnel, you literally can feel the mood, the raw emotions that really shaped this unrest in Charlotte over the course of a week. And this was actually one of the places that we had to put some signage that essentially said, it's very triggering. During that editing session, we had a number of activists who said, hey, I can't even go down that protest tunnel because it is so triggering to hear the sounds, to see the images in conversation with one another. And so we had to put some messaging in the exhibition to give people that choice of whether or not that experience would be triggering for them or not. And so those are the kinds of the ways in which museums can empathize and create the kinds of visitor experiences that give people choices about the information they want to engage with.
This is one of the things that I was really excited about hearing some background from you about was that kind of sensory tunnel, because I visited the exhibit and that I was never in the protests. I was not in, there was not a history for me for it to trigger, but it was extremely difficult even for me to go through that area. And it's something we thought about at the Orange County Regional History Center. It's been proposed to us by community members, by other people helping us do exhibits about creating like a similar situation, like a sensory experience, and that's something that we have always decided not to do, kind of for those. I mean, we've been so concerned about, re-traumatizing anybody when it comes to the Pulse nightclub shooting, and the Ocoee Massacre exhibit that's open now. Um, but I did really appreciate in your exhibit that it wasn't a tunnel that you had to go through to go to the next part of the exhibit.
Absolutely.
You could skip it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Folks, they had a choice, right? Visitors had a choice. And most visitors seem to be um, the entire experience can be overwhelming, frankly. And so the tunnel, by the time you get to the tunnel, you have this knowledge of all of the events that kind of led up to the Keith Lamont Scott shooting. And so in some ways, any part of that experience could have been triggering.
Right.
But that tunnel in particular for activists specifically was quite triggering.
But I
Right.
thought it was very useful for someone like me who wasn't active in the protests. It was as if I got to share in that a little bit in a very small way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that was our goal. We wanted people to be sort of boots on the ground in the exhibition, that they could actually feel like they were there. And so that was one of the ways that we activated that kind of sensory experience. We know that museums aren't just cabinets of curiosity, right? Where you go and the things that you collect, they end up in the gallery on display. Museums are also sites for civic and cultural engagement, and programming was a particularly important part of the No Justice, No Peace exhibit and the community initiative. And we did a number of programs, but one of the most successful ones was the Breaking Bread Dinner and Dialogue initiative. We really wanted to create an opportunity for members of our community to come together across difference and to have those difficult conversations with individuals and collectives that they normally wouldn't be in conversation with. The way that we did this is by we collected zip codes. And in many cities, certainly in the South, your zip code certainly determines your socioeconomic location in a society. And so we use the zip code as a way to diversify our tables. So someone from South Charlotte would be in conversation with someone from West Charlotte. And the assumption is that you bring that difference, that varied or nuanced perspective to the table. And so we took on issues like social capital. We took on police involved shootings. We took on a whole host of topics to convene these small table conversations. And I remember we did 3 of them. Each of them sold out. We also made several tickets available for members of our community who may not be able to afford the ticket. So that again, we had a socioeconomic diversity of people in that space. When we ended this series, everyone was like, when's the next series starting? Because it created this environment where we could talk about those hard issues. And who can't have a thoughtful conversation over hard issues when you have a plate of salmon and macaroni and cheese and cornbread being passed around family style? And so we really created this community of folks that felt comfortable having hard conversations, breaking bread together, learning about the nuances of South Charlotte and West Charlotte and East Charlotte, and the issues that impact us all, but perhaps impact us in some different ways. We did a book club and an author talkback series. It included Carol Anderson, who wrote the book White Rage, as well as many others. We really got a great participation from community members, and it was a way to also to have conversations about scholarship and about, sort of published works with community members, again, to continue to build on the content of the exhibition. And we also did a concert series, which was a mobile concert series called Listen Up Charlotte. We brought together the Charlotte Symphony, a, um, a jazz ensemble, spoken word artists, and I choreographed historical content and interwove it in between the performances. And we took these to churches, we took them to college campuses, to cafeterias and some of the public schools. And it really was just fantastic. And it lent itself to an intergenerational audience. And then we would end with a dialogue about community issues. It was fantastic. I'll stop there and welcome any additional questions you might have.
Thank you both. I am definitely left with this sense that what an important role museums play in the power of healing after tragedy. And you know, we've had our share of doing some of that with Pulse, but I've been hearing a lot of similar sentiments from the two of you in these instances about connecting with people and how that can really help grow understanding and eventually move into healing, a healing place. So museums as an active and a healing place.
Whitney, can I add something to what you're saying too? The other thing that I think we forget sometimes as museum practitioners is that we're members of the community as well. And so in many ways, we're also having to be quite stoic and having to really muff our own emotions so that we can provide these objective, at least within a history museum, these kind of objective and scholarly interventions, right? And I can tell you that when this exhibition was done, I remember walking into the galleries and just weeping because I really had to set aside my own personal and emotional response to what was happening in my hometown to curate an experience that would allow our community writ large to process these events. And so, you know, there's a lot happening in terms of resiliency training and trauma-informed care within the museum field that I think many of our institutions that seek to be engaged in social justice work, that we should be also thinking about those kinds of training for our community, but certainly for our staff as well.
We have a question in the chat that is asking about during these hard conversations, did you have a diverse participation ideology-wise or mostly like-minded individuals? What are your thoughts on presenting difficult content / conversations and garnering participation from, I think there's more of that, but there we go, from both sides of the issues? And I think you spoke a lot to that, Brenda. Pasha, I don't know if you want to jump in, or Brenda, if you have anything more to speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome presentation, Brenda. Thoroughly impressed. We definitely took a much different approach. Whereas Brenda was definitely more community related, we wanted to target and stamp out that racial bias with definitely members of law enforcement and with those type of people first. So we instituted a racial diversity training through the history of Goldsboro. And so we've had that with the Sanford Police Department, as well as with the Seminole County Sheriff's Department and with other members of the community. First, we needed to make sure that it wasn't just from the bottom up that we saw change, but from the top down that we saw change as well. Because the community spoke. We heard the community loud and clear. And the community was very strong at the rallies. The community was very outspoken when it came to media requests or saying how they felt and documented through social media. We knew how the community felt. But how did the leaders on the ground, how did the leaders that are to protect us, such as in that what Brenda was saying, how are they going to change now moving forward? How do we move the needle?
Absolutely.
And so that's one of the ways that we did, is through instituted through the humanities. That's how we change the needle, change that narrative so it doesn't happen again.
And we did something very similar. I didn't talk about this, but one of the things that we did was I founded or launched a series called No Charlotte, and it was targeted for corporate and nonprofit organizations. And what we did was trained um, corporate offices like Bank of America was one of my clients, Vanguard, those institutions that have such a huge profile in the city by virtue of where the field that they're in. It was a great revenue stream for the museum, but it also said that, hey, if our community is going to be constituents of your bank, of your institution, why not prepare you with the sort of cultural competency training and an understanding of the history of Charlotte so that you can better interface with our community in a more thoughtful way. And so we had a No Charlotte initiative for corporate and nonprofit professionals as part of our suite of programs.
We only have a couple more minutes, so I want to go ahead and wrap up, maybe do a last minute call for any more questions. Just type them in real quick. Um, but also say, tell everyone attending that Brenda Tyndall is no longer at the Levine Museum of the New South. She is now, if you didn't catch that in her introduction, she is now at the International African American Museum, which is opening 2022, right?
That's correct.
In
That's
South
correct.
Carolina. So keep your eye open. Maybe a field trip is in your future. And then Pasha Baker is at the Goldsboro Museum, which is just in Sanford. It's just probably up the road, considering where everybody probably is viewing from. From you, I would highly recommend visiting her in the Goldsboro Museum whenever you feel comfortable. Especially, we had someone comment in the chat that they had no idea that history about Sanford, Florida, and Trayvon Martin and the memorial. I would also encourage everyone to look into the history of Goldsboro, because before I visited the Goldsboro Museum, I had no idea that Goldsboro was also founded by the brother of Eatonville, by the brother of the founder of Eatonville, and that they're basically twin cities. And the history of Goldsboro just went so very differently than Eatonville. And that is a fascinating dive into, again, another way that Black lives have been historically suppressed. So please do look into the history of Goldsboro and reach out to the Goldsboro Museum as well. Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been fantastic. I have enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk more about this important work